Greetings, folks. This is Scott, and you're tuning into A Woman's Place, the podcast where we break down all the policies and politics that affect the 51%. That's right, women are half the U.S. population, and Ashley and I are here to give you the facts about how today's events are affecting them. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, Ashley Brown.
Hello, Scott Osborne. How are you?
Excellent. How are you?
I am terrific and excited to continue our conversation with Stephanie Coontz.
Yes, if you have not listened to the first session, please go back and do it. They are separate. You can just listen to this one, but you will want to hear the first. We really talked about the history of marriage and what it has looked like, in fact, over thousands of years. And no shocker, it's not what many people think, including us, as we read Stephanie's book. So it was very different, but Stephanie is the foremost expert on marriage in America. She has been writing books on this. And should we just get started?
Let's get started.
Okay. Okay, so Stephanie Coontz will be joining us again today, is the professor emerita at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. She's also the director of research and public education for the Council on Contemporary Families. She's authored 6 books on gender, family, and history, including Marriage, A History, How Love Conquered Marriage, which I have and which I read when it first came out, and it changed a lot of things I did, and it was quoted in the Supreme Court decision on marriage equality. She's also authored The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, and A Strange Stirring, The Feminine Mystique and American Women at the Dawn of the 1960s. Her most recent book is For Better and Worse, about marriages today. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks for having me on.
Yes, so last show we did a quick dive into the history of marriage. We encourage everyone to listen to that, back from the Stone Age up to the dawn of the 20th century. And I'm going to summarize. I won't make you summarize. I'm going to summarize and say it isn't what people think it was. It was very varied. As you pointed out, roles were very varied, and men and women did not have these social roles that we associate with them today. That has all been a process of evolution, if you will. I hope that's accurate.
Fair enough.
Yeah. All right, so let's start with the 20th century. Now, here we are, and as you've said to us as we were closing last show, that you saw this whole shift kind of in, I hesitate to say middle class norms, but dating changed and morality changed, and you sort of opened up men and women's relationships, which also served to stigmatize same-sex relationships, but I think they started to date and be independent and be more physically and sexually open about it. Is that an accurate description of kind of the dawn of the 20th century?
Yes, very good.
So then we have sort of the pre-war period. I mean, what were some of the biggest shifts there before we get into the 1950s? Because the 1950s sort of looms large in many people's imaginations, but we had a whole war period there before that.
Well, first we went to the 1920s, which is interesting because the new ideas about gender and marriage and sexuality caused a huge backlash, very similar to what we've seen recently. The same kind of conspiracy theories. The auto magnate of that time, Henry Ford, said that there was a deep state. He said it was run by Jewish people that was trying to, coordinate everything. There was the idea that women were being taken across state lines to be trafficked. Just like today, you've got people claiming that if you go across straight lines to get an abortion, you're trafficking your fetus. So all sorts of really interesting parallels there. But after a while, the hysteria died down, and then you had the Depression and World War II. And World War II was interesting because women entered the workforce then and really seemed to enjoy it. My mom worked as a ship fitter in Seattle during the time, but as soon they enjoyed earning the wages, they showed that they could do it. And it was interesting that the propaganda they showed them with muscles on their arms, saying you can do
the
it.
riveter.
Yeah. And as soon as the boys came home, my mom, like everybody else, was fired. And although many women wanted to keep their jobs, they were told, no, you can't do that. And they sent back in the home. And of course, after the Depression first and then the hardships of the war, I think the initial feeling of many women was, well, it would have been nice to keep my job. But like my mom told me, she said, well, now at least I have a chance to have a child. And, we've got an expanding economy, and my husband can earn enough for a while. And so people retreated into the home. But the retreat was really hammered home by 1950s laws and regulations. What is so stunning to me is that people idealize the 1950s family. Um, I understand, and we'll come back to why they might have it. But if you look at reality of it, when we tried this before, when people tell us we should go back to it, we tried it before, and that's what caused the feminist movement. It wasn't, the young daughters who ran off on their own, rebelling against their moms. It was women like my mom who suddenly said, I can't stand this anymore. I have to change, this is not working for me. And other women who said to their daughters, don't just get married like me, go out and get a job. So when we actually look at the marriages of the 1950s, there were much higher rates of domestic violence. I mean, some of it would stand your hair on end. Actual psychiatrists were saying that actually wife beating was often a healthy way for a man to regain his authority in the home if the woman had been too not even disobedient, but too kind of masculine or uppity. You have your oral histories where people said, well, I don't know why I'm so unhappy, these women would say in the 60s when they were interviewed, because if you've got a man who hardly ever hits you and doesn't drink a lot, you're a lot better off than my mom was, so I ought to be happy. This was a period when marital rape was totally legal. It didn't get made illegal in the last two states of America until 1992. Child abuse rates were higher. So it's crazy to look back and idealize the families of the 50s, unless, of course, you are thinking about the fact that it was a lot easier to form a family. And what I argue in the book is that there are two reasons for this short-lived flourishing of the family. One was that men who could get a job at a young age and see steadily increasing wages across the board, better working conditions, and the material conditions. The taxes rates were lower on working people than they were on rich people at that time. There was huge government investment in the highway projects, building projects. So it was a time of prosperity. So young men could get married, and young women had no way to participate in the expanding economy without getting married themselves. So it looked on the outskirts, and if you were lucky, it could be in reality a pretty good time to start a family. But underneath that was the fact that there were no protections against the abuse of women or children, and that had to change.
Well, and so I think one important thing to note too is the economics of the time. That housing, to buy a house, it was about double the amount of your salary, where today it's 6 times your annual salary. And so some of the, the very basics of being able to know that you could graduate high school as a man and make a wage that could support a family. And that just doesn't exist.
Exactly. And there wasn't what we've seen since is just an extraordinary and just I got a loss for words because it's so extraordinary explosion of inequality like we've never seen before, even in the Gilded Age. And I think that's what, if two Rand economists recently studied the wages, because everybody's wages were rising and they were rising faster than the profits of the top 10%. They said if the wage patterns from 1945 to the end of the 70s had continued, everybody, whatever income they started at, would have been 70%, making 70% more than they did at the end. Instead, of course, we saw real wages stagnant or fall for many people, and the people who made out like bandits were the top 20% and especially 2% of the economy. In fact, we have what some economists have quite frankly called a plutonomy today, where the top 20% and 2% in particular of the economy drives more than half the spending, which creates a situation not only where you have economic precarity, just really not being able to keep up with not only housing, but little things like you used to be able to afford going to ball games. Look at what it costs to go to major ball games today. Because the rich are bidding up anything that can't be mass produced, like cheap clothes or a computer or a TV. They're bidding up the prices for it. So people are being they're wondering where their future is going to be, what their kids' future is going to be, if their kids are going to buy a home. And they're also, and I'm increasingly thinking that this is really more important than I realized even at the time I was writing the book. This economy that's oriented to for the privilege of the rich means that people are becoming socially invisible unless they're high worth customers. It's like if you're a regular customer, you have to sit online listening to music for hours to get through, whereas the high worth customers get immediate assistance. And you see this everywhere in the boarding of planes, where we found that when people have to board the plane through the first class section after waiting for the first class people to get settled and take up the space, we get much more incidents of air rage than the past. So I've come to think of this, and my son helped me understand it, that when people look back at the 50s, they're looking back at a different economy, and they're misrepresenting and thinking that maybe it was because the families were better. But in fact, it was because of the economic changes. And my son, who's a physician, said to me, well, Mom, you're talking about referred pain. We see this all the time, that your brain is really not able to tell which of your internal organs is exactly having a problem. So if you've got something wrong with your internal organ, the brain will look for an external part of your body that has some of the same nerves attached to it. So if you've got a esophagus is being pushed because you ate too much, that's connected to your shoulder and or the neck, and your brain will tell you, oh, we have neck pain. Or if you have problem in the back of your jaw, it will often come up as shoulder pain. And so that's called referred pain. And it was just a wonderful idea for me, because I realized it is real pain. And maybe I've been unfair to the people who are saying, let's go back to 1950s families. So, 1950s families are better. Maybe I'm saying, you're not imagining it, that some things were better. It's just that you're misdiagnosing what was better and what has started to hurt since.
Well, I think I agree. I think it's a diagnosis, but I think it's also, because I do empathize with that. And many people would welcome not having to have, two members of a couple, both frantically working, trying to raise kids at the same time. That's very hard. But I think it's also that people can't change some of the other underlying things that have changed. We were the global dominant economy in 1950. The rest of the world was practically decimated. We're not putting globalization back in the can. We're no longer a manufacturing nation, which is a lot of which provided these jobs for all these men. We can't go back on that one. Marriage is one that people sort of feel maybe is in our control, because the rest of it is really out of our control in many ways. Now, you could argue it's brought many other good things, globalization, service economy, but those were two. Also unionization. Unionization was huge. I don't see people clamoring for unions these days, but marriage, when the family life, I think for many people feels like one that maybe it's kind of in our control to bring some changes about, in that idolization. I think it's wrong, but I can understand why that's the vehicle that they think maybe to hitch themselves to. But I want to go back to one other thing. This talk about the 1950s and the social roles. It also feels like what I call the dominance model of men now. It seems to reign so supreme. And I know legally women were subordinate before, and I'm sure there was domestic violence for much of history in some way, but this notion that, men have these controls in the home, and that just feels like it looms so large after the war. And I don't know, some other sociologist would have to tell me if there's connections, if it's the new market economy, if it's post-war, if it's something else. So that stood out to me. And the other thing that stood out is now, I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, you start to see the growth of women who see that their value hitched to the patriarchy. Their value now is connected to the rise and fall of their husband, it seems like. And because there's so many women, I think, who still have those attitudes.
Well, you've always had that though. So it's just they're just more they have more access to the press
I
in a
guess, yes.
society that's increasingly ruled by you know the who can buy time on the press and who are influencers. I think that the extent to which men have adopted this new manosphere ideals is exaggerated. I was looking just the other day at the General Social Survey, which has been asking since 1977, how do you feel about this? Strongly agree or strongly disagree? That it's better for everyone involved if the man goes out and earns the living and the woman takes care of the home. That strongly disagree rose and rose and rose and rose and rose right up till 2022. Then there was a little dip in 2024. So in other words, that didn't cause that didn't cause this kind of thing. I think that what has happened is that as you've gotten more and more inequality, um, people and been subjected to the idea that the hope and change stuff didn't really come for people, they began to look around for other answers. And I'm inclined to think that people initially would not have gone that way except for this tremendous alliance, this very dangerous alliance that I describe in detail in my book between the really hard right Christians who are totally in favor of the subordination of women. Some of them even want to take away the vote from women, and the hard right uh, economic, what they call themselves, free economy, but it's not a free economy. They're in favor of a monopolistic economy. And those people made an alliance to break down the New Deal, to drive out, and they found that one way to do it was to emphasize the family, to redirect in a certain sense. If you're feeling resentful about taxes or about how much the rich get, let's redirect it and talk about how much women are getting or how much men are losing in this series. So I'm a little more optimistic than it sounds like you are about the fact that this doesn't become hardwired into people's ideas. But to the extent that we have not really seriously taken on how much our society has been corrupted by money and by the kind of privileges that are given to the rich. The other day, actually, my husband looked this up for me. There are 45 families in this country who are worth more than $45 billion. Now, if each of those families spent $1 million a week, they would still have more than 100 years before they ran out of money. And that's if they didn't earn a single penny. And these are the people who are claiming that they're being taxed too much and the rest of us have to pay the price.
So another shift from the 50s, I think the wealth gap was 30% more, and now it's 600% more.
Yeah, it's huge.
That's a significant change. And I want to touch on it a little before I know, Scott, we want to kind of go into a deeper direction, but I loved the whole conversation about nostalgia and that what we kind of where nostalgia started and then the kind of positive personal nostalgia versus societal. Can you talk about that just a little bit? Because I think it just helps put things into perspective on how we go down that track.
Yeah, because there's two different kinds of nostalgia that we can trace historically and sociologically. Personal nostalgia is a feeling that you get when you would like to recapture some good interactions or feelings or memories or experiences. It actually physically makes you feel warmer when you engage in that. And it actually leads you to seek out new experiences. It doesn't lead you to sit around and think, I wish I didn't, all these new people weren't around. So that's kind of healthy nostalgia, is the idea I had great experiences here. I love remembering them and talking about them. And in fact, it makes me feel so positive that I may go out and meet some new friends and do some new things. But then there's pathological nostalgia. And we've seen this before. In fact, the word comes from, it was invented by a doctor to describe this epidemic that swept across Europe and America as wage labor became more triumphant, and old communities were broken down. And in that day, so nostalgia literally meant missing of a home, homesickness, wanting to go home. And that kind of nostalgia, it was very serious. People were said to have died from it. And I take it seriously, because that kind of nostalgia is when you start to think everything is going wrong. We'll never get anything back again the way it used to be. And therefore, I miss the way it used to be so bad that I can't accept anything new. And I hate anything new. And I blame them for taking away what was old. And that's the difference between healthy nostalgia and pathological nostalgia. And I think that we're seeing a new bunch of pathological nostalgia that really needs to be combated in this society. It didn't come on all of a sudden. For example, you know, when you think about people saying, some of my friends who are progressive friends say, well, it was racism that elected Donald Trump. But you know, that's not quite true. I live in Washington State, and the logging industries in Washington State are primarily white and not very liberal, not very liberal at all. But those logging counties went very hard for Obama the first time around. The next time around, they went a little less hard. And by the third time, when Trump came and the Democrats had still not followed up on hope and change, they went hard for Trump. So that doesn't mean that, to me, that they are inveterate racists. It means to me that people who want social change have not been clear enough about what are the problems and how we hope to fix them for everybody.
I love this. I want to take us to a little bit to sort of the modern marriage, since we're moving quickly up into the modern day. You've talked about the deinstitutionalization of marriage. And so, and as we started off in the first show saying that most people actually want marriage, you know, but they want the relationship. Now, essentially, you know, women can have economic security and social respect and all these things without marriage. People have to want to come together. So talk to us a little bit about kind of how you see why people do or do not marry. We know they're marrying later, but evidence, I think, seems to suggest that they will marry at some point in most cases. So talk to us a little bit about kind of what you think it looks like today.
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that, yes, people still are marrying. And as I said earlier, very few people, only 6 to 8 people, say they definitely don't want to marry. Most people want to be in a marriage or marriage-like relationship. But there are 2 different things, I think, that are causing the decrease in marriage rates. And the increase, and interestingly, that decrease in marriage rate, though, is accompanied by a decrease in divorce rates. Among people who do marry, they actually have lower divorce rates than people who married in the 1950s. And what we're seeing here is another sign of the class polarization that we talked about earlier, and the inequality. At the very time as we've developed these new ideals of marriage, they require much more effort than when somebody could say, well, you're lucky if you got a man who hardly ever hits you and doesn't drink
too much.
Now we expect to have a real mutual understanding, to be mutually supportive, to really care about the other person's ability and growth as a human being, but also to support our own. This kind of marriage takes much more negotiation. It takes much more time and attention. At the very time that the economic pressures and the time pressures of our society are making that very, very hard. And we know from research that time scarcity and economic scarcity are huge predictors of conflict. In fact, studies of newlyweds find that financial insecurity or time insecurity is a bigger predictor of marital problems and negative interactions than family of origin issues, like whether your parents had a divorce or even how happy you are in your marriage. So people are finding that out even without the research. And particularly they're finding it out. And here's the answer to the paradox of low divorces and yet less marriage. Today, most marriages begin as cohabitation. But what we're finding is that a growing percentage of people who move in intending to marry break up before they marry. And I think the reason they break up is because these are people normally we're saying we don't have much. We're not sure we're ready to marry. We don't have enough to put down a down payment on a home. We're not even sure we can pay all our bills. So we're going to move in together. And as soon as we meet a certain economic bar, we will get married. When they get married, they tend when they meet that economic bar, they tend to get married. But unfortunately, the kind of tensions I was just talking about often tear them apart before they get married. So the people who get married are the ones who've been able to cohabit or not cohabit. The majority do cohabit, and feel that they've gotten enough security to get married. For these people, there's a different kind of tension in marriage. And that has to do with the fact usually they're often two incomes. They're people who have worked together to be egalitarian, and they're doing fine until they have kids. And then when they have kids, it's no longer the happy, complete thing that they expected. It's a lot of work. And there are all sorts of tensions about the leftover messages that, oh, it's women who are in charge of kids. Women are the experts on home care. And yet these women have often been working outside the home and don't want to give that up. The men have to work more outside the home, usually, that they've been earning more, and they also tend to be more penalized if they ask for extra time off work. And they're being told, that you should also be working at home. But they also come to this with less experience in the first place with fathering and with caretaking and with doing home. And so we've got all of these, what in my book I call these earworms, these habits. We as women who say, oh, well, we have to be responsible for everything and do the emotion work and stuff. And the men who think, well, yeah, I'm responsible for cleaning the drains and they're responsible for the other thing. So these kind of habits get pushed against each other in real problems, as even we've got these new work pressures, more work pressures. We're working longer hours than ever before, or at least before the reforms of the 1950s and 60s. And at the same time, we have higher expectations of parenting than ever before, partly because we're anxious about our kids' future. And these get mushed up with the problems of what happens when the woman stays home with the kids, which makes perfect sense at the beginning, but tends to translate itself into her becoming the expert and him becoming more and more exempt from knowing what goes on at home, till by the time she does go back to work or wants to go back to work, they're having all of these conflicts. So there are all of these kinds of tensions on the marriages that do get formed. And then those are different from the ones who don't get formed. So we have to work on two levels. We have to improve the economic situation for people. We have to decrease the work hours. We can certainly afford to do that in our economy, an economy in which 45 families can have $45 billion on their own. And we also have to get people to think through more carefully what those earworms are. Realize that equality is something that takes extra work for all of us. And we all, as a woman, I hear all of the female complaints about the men, and they're often very justified. The guy who says, I'll get to it, I'll get to it, I'll get to it, and then is surprised when the woman gets to it and is furious that it's been delayed that long. But we women have habits we have to break too. I tell the story in my book about, for years, I've been talking about gatekeeping, which is women have been so trained that we're the experts in home life and kids, that we think we know it all, and we want our husband to help, but we want him to do it their way. And what that tends to do is not make the man feel respected. It doesn't give him the incentive to learn or the desire to learn. And yet, the very first time that our grandchild came out here and started wailing, I was in the kitchen, my husband was in the living room holding the grandchild. Without even thinking about it, because I didn't think about it, I swooped into the living room, grabbed the child out of his arms, started going, grandma's great at this stuff, and then looked around and I saw that he was absolutely furious with me. And, one of the things that saved it from being a major fight is I said, oh, I'm doing it again. I'm sorry. We both knew, we had both discussed over the years what gatekeeping is, the habits that women have as well as the habits that men have. It takes that kind of work and communication, which is why I think knowing the history and the sociology can actually help us get over some of these conflicts that we have personally at the same time as we work for better support systems for our families as a whole.
I agree. And we have reached our time, Scott. So I'm going to let you wrap us up. Stephanie, amazing and so thought-provoking. And thank you for sharing.
It was my
Thank
pleasure.
you so much.
talking to
Yeah,
you.
I mean, I could take this so many different directions. I have so many thoughts, as I'm sure many of our listeners will, but many nuggets. Your book, I underlined all throughout it. And I thought I'd read a lot in this area, but I learned so much. So we're very grateful for the work you do and that you have done. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.